Great. Well, thanks, Rick. Could have just kept talking about martial arts all day. I don't think anyone knew they were coming to
Don't let me stop you.
no one thought they were coming to a panel on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but the panel on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is down the hall if anyone was planning on coming to that. So thank you everyone for joining our panel on preferences today. Our preferences, right, for your jurisdiction. My name is Zach Burke. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the founder and managing partner at Exigy. We're a digital agency, a B Corp. We partner with nonprofits and government to use design and technology to improve lives. And we're the creators of something called Bloom Housing, which is a web-based affordable housing platform that scales equitable access to affordable housing process in the Bay Area. And just this year, we've begun expanding that work nationally in partnership with the city of Detroit, where we're launching a product called Detroit Home Connect in the coming months. So I'm a software engineer and a product designer. What am I doing here at Housing California? Moderating a panel on preferences. Well, our platform, Bloom, is designed to make it easy for folks to find and apply to housing that they're eligible for. And because we're a mission-driven technology firm, we seek to ensure that our work expands equitable access to housing. And so through this work, we've learned a lot about housing preferences and how critical they are to equitable housing policy. And we knew that as designers and technologists, we had to learn how the policy system worked in order to implement a digital system that supports it. So through our work, we've learned how important preferences are to communities that are seeking to allocate scarce housing investments to those who are most marginalized, and to focus on keeping housed those communities that are being most pushed out today or that have been kept out in the past. We know that these housing preference policies are important tools, and we know, because we've been talking to jurisdictions around the country, that many jurisdictions are eager to implement policies like these, but not sure how to do it. And that's why I'm so excited about our panel today. We have some experts here today who can help us answer the critical questions: what, why, and how with regard to housing preference policies. So today, we're joined by incredible champions within the affordable housing space. We're going to talk about the importance of evaluating a jurisdiction's financial, political, legal, and technological bandwidth before implementing preference policies that advance housing equity. I'm sure it's going to be a lively discussion today. I'll make sure that we have some time at the end for questions from the audience. A couple of quick logistics. Please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask any questions you may have. There's a little, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it by now, but there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of your black screen. You can press it and the question will go to our group. And we'll come to those at the end. In case we don't cover anything you're interested in, please feel free to reach out to us after. You can find myself, you can find all the other panelists on LinkedIn, connect with us and continue discussion. Please feel free to leave your email address with your question and we'll make sure we get back to you. Okay, so with those logistics aside, let's get started. Panelists, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce yourself. Please start with your name, your pronouns, your organization, and share one thing you're excited to discuss today. Davisha, can we start with you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Davisha. I work for the City of Portland Housing Bureau. And one thing, my pronouns, of course, are she, her, hers. One thing I'm excited to discuss today is just about how preferences have benefited folks and also how preferences can be improved to lay really the groundwork for building opportunities for folks to move back to their neighborhoods. Very excited to be here today.
Thank you, Davisha. So great to have you. Jessica.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessica Gomez, and I, she, her pronouns, and I'm with the Office of Housing at the City of Seattle. I'm really excited to build more community with like-minded folks who are looking to really push the the gauge on equitable development and what that means, and thinking about community preference and all the possibilities and creative juices flowing as we think about changing or moving this policy forward to a more equitable housing policies.
Thank you, Jessica. Rick?
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Rick Jacobus. I'm a consultant. My firm is called Street Level Advisors. I use he, him pronouns. I do mostly housing policy with different cities, including with San Francisco, relevant to today's topic, where I helped set up and sort of implement their preference policies. And I'm excited to talk today about how to be more explicit about race and use preference policies to consciously address racial equity rather than doing it sort of by proxy.
Thanks, Rick. I imagine there's a lot of folks here who are really interested in that, so thanks for that. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to cover some of the why, some of the how, some of the what. Let's start with the why. Davisha, can I start with you? Why do we want to implement housing preferences?
I would say, well, historically, we've seen a lot of, racist housing practices and urban renewal development in areas that are typically populated by Black and Brown folks. We've been seeing that it removes folks from resources, safe spaces, and other places where they can just commune and gather together and build. Folks have missed out on generational wealth building opportunities, and the list really goes on. So preference is one of the vital tools to help people, one of the vital equitable tools to help people to move back into their historical neighborhoods and keep them there for generations to come with respect to the current fair housing practices in place. It's beginning to move us in the direction of building what my co-panelists are saying around building equitable policies and equitable development in those areas and laying the foundation for it being truly reparative work.
Thanks, Davisha. Anything anyone wants to add, Jessica or Rick?
I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of why as we go along.
Yeah, I really appreciate you framing the reparative nature of housing preference policies, Davisha, to repair the past harms, in addition to ensuring that we are moving towards equity today. So we've seen housing preferences here in the Bay have a huge impact on who gets prioritized. Rick, I know you've done a lot of work here in the Bay Area to understand that impact. I know we'd all like to ensure that housing preferences are used to prioritize vulnerable communities, but we've also seen that housing preferences aren't always used that way. How can we ensure that housing preferences aren't used to keep communities homogenous?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's really important as we talk in this workshop, like San Francisco and Portland and Seattle have in common an interest in using preferences as a tool to promote inclusion. But we have to be really clear that in most of our history in this country, housing preferences of the very kind we're talking about have been used more often as a tool of racial exclusion. So the fair housing laws that we have in this country have been designed specifically to prevent communities from using these kinds of community preferences to maintain segregation. So you sort of picture these white suburban, predominantly white suburban communities that say, when we want to build affordable housing, we want to make sure that people from our community are the ones who move into that housing. But if the community is mostly white, that means that the housing is mostly going to benefit white residents. And the fair housing law has targeted that and said, no, we're not going to allow that. That's even if the intent weren't explicitly to promote segregation, when there's an indirect effect, it's still illegal. And the legal standard that we have is called disparate impact. And the idea that HUD and the courts have implemented is that you have to be able to show that your community is diverse in order to use a local preference. So you can't have a preference for a community that's predominantly one race. But if you have a diverse community, you can have a local preference because the preference won't have the indirect effect of providing a barrier to integration. Well, that's great. And it's, it's a kind of a triumph of our fair housing system that we've been able to stop communities from using preferences in that way. Though the practice still goes on and it's still a constant struggle. The fair housing attorneys and the advocates are pushing all the time against communities that are trying to use preferences to maintain segregation. But what Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and a lot of other cities now are trying to do is to use neighborhood preferences to redress that past harm and to overcome that segregation, and the same legal standards apply. So right now, you have to prove that you have to pass that same disparate impact test to use preferences in the opposite direction. So I ran the disparate impact analysis for San Francisco, and what we had to do is look at every neighborhood in San Francisco and what the racial composition of that neighborhood was, and say if we give a preference to people from this neighborhood, will that have the effect of making it harder for one group or another to get into the housing? And what we found was that, yeah, at the extreme, it might. So the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco said they wanted to do a 40% of the units, they wanted to have neighborhood preference. But what we found was that at 40%, in some neighborhoods, one racial group or another ended up with a statistically significant advantage thanks to the neighborhood preference, and that wasn't going to be allowed. And so HUD actually told San Francisco no on preferences. And so when they implement these preferences, they don't do them, the neighborhood preferences, in the projects that are funded with HUD money. But the state of California, HCD, said you can do the preferences, but only at 25%. So because we found at 25% of the units, the impact wasn't statistically significant. There was a small enough shift in the racial composition of the, who moved into the housing that it didn't change, relative to sort of random chance. It wasn't too far of an outlier. And so that was the test. And what I think is really important before we talk more about sort of how to further racial equity is just to see how the basis of our fair housing law actually limits the effectiveness of preferences as a tool for redress, right? A lot of the stakeholders in San Francisco want to see these preferences not just as a way to fight against displacement sort of regardless of race, which they work well as, but as a tool to fight the displacement of specific communities of color, right? The Black community in San Francisco in particular has been kind of decimated by displacement. And the preferences offer a way to say, well, we're going to stem that tide and maybe even reverse the tide. But because of the way fair housing law is written, we actually can't implement the preferences if they're effective in that way. Like it's illegal as soon as we can show that they're actually effectively favoring one racial group, even if that's the racial group that has been ultimately on the short end of all of the previous housing policies. So there's just there's some real thinking that we have to do about how to be more proactive in our housing policy. And I think a lot of people in San Francisco are saying, well, we need to figure out a way to do explicitly racially targeted preferences in a way that's still fair and appropriate. And the fair housing law doesn't let us use neighborhood residents as a proxy for race in that way. I hope that made sense.
Thanks, Rick. So I think I hear you saying that particularly with neighborhood preferences, we have to be careful at both ends of the spectrum. There's ways in which neighborhood preferences in communities that are not very diverse can be used to essentially be exclusionary.
Yeah.
But in some communities, like more urban communities like San Francisco, where there is a diversity within each neighborhood, then the preferences can be used as a tool for equity. But then we potentially run afoul of fair housing law. Is that right? And if so, how have you seen San Francisco deal with that? Are there other preferences that they're using on top of those neighborhood preferences that are enabling them to work around those legal restrictions?
Yeah, San Francisco has a list of separate preferences that it implements, and they're not the same in every single project. But the first one they apply is a certificate of preferences. People who were displaced by the city's redevelopment agency back during urban renewal get first opportunity for all new housing units. And because the program is targeting the specific families that were harmed by city action, there's no disparate impact test. It doesn't matter that those families were mostly African-American because they were directly impacted. And I think that relates to what we'll hear about in Portland a little bit later. But so they implement that effectively. I mean, it only, it's got a lot of challenges, but there's not a legal challenge there. They have a preference for people who are recently displaced because of an Ellis Act eviction, which is also, isn't interpreted in the same way as the neighborhood preference. But then they have a neighborhood preference and a preference for people who live and work in San Francisco. And a lot of cities want to have a preference for people who live or work in their city and can't. San Francisco can because it's a diverse city, right? If you have a diverse enough population, that preference doesn't create a fair housing concern because the population of San Francisco is actually more racially diverse than the broader region. But in a lot of places, you can't have that kind of a preference. And then there's this neighborhood preference, and a lot of the attention in the recent years has been around the neighborhood preference because it's their attempt to try to stem, to stop displacement, and it's been effective in that regard, but it's limited by this sort of fair housing concerns. So I don't think it's not a good tool. It's like Davisha said, it's one tool in a broader strategy, but I think we have to see that it's a limited tool because of fair housing. And if we don't want to overthrow fair housing just to get these preferences in urban areas because they're really important. Fair housing is really important in all the rest of the country. We need to not weaken this tool in those places.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I think it's really, Rick's highlighted for us a number of the ways in which there are limitations to the preferences we can put in place, either because they are going to have a disparate impact that is not the impact we're trying to achieve, or because we're going to run afoul of well-meaning laws, but ones which are going to be used to limit the effectiveness of our policies. Davisha, Rick mentioned some of the work that you've been doing. How did you guys do it? How did you implement effective and equitable preferences within the context of those limitations?
Sorry about that. Phone rang right when you asked that question, the realities of working from home. So one way that we did that is what was unique about our policy is we were able to implement a point system. So this point system allowed for people who have historic ties to the neighborhood to be prioritized while not excluding anyone who currently lives in the geographic area that we were focusing on and moving people back to. But also focusing on those who have been displaced from those areas. That point system allowed us to get folks who not only currently lived there or who were displaced from that particular area, but folks who had ties and ways of their ancestors lived there. We really wanted to capture the details. We did a lot of research and dating back decades ago, decades before I was even born, to encapsulate that loss of opportunity and generational wealth and that community building that I was talking about, resources, I was talking about earlier. So our point system paired with a number of, I would say that the partnerships we had with our community partners who also had a similar focus in moving that work is the way that we were able to do that. It was remarkable in that it didn't exclude folks who even currently live in the neighborhood, because as time passed, we saw a more homogeneous neighborhood. We saw a neighborhood that didn't reflect the historic Black neighborhood that was once there. So it allowed everyone to apply, but that prioritization and that point system was really the key.
So I hear you saying that the point system made sure that nobody from the neighborhood was excluded, while at the same time ensuring that you were able to prioritize those who have been most harmed by past policies or who are being pushed out most today. Is that right?
Exactly, yes.
That's fascinating. And so you were able to get around some of the limitations that Rick mentioned earlier by not limiting yourself to a single metric like neighborhood preference, but instead pulling together a number of different data points that allowed you to prioritize the communities you wanted to prioritize.
Exactly. And that was embedded, of course, in our application for the easement of the person who was completing the application for that, for those opportunities. Yes.
Thanks, Davisha. Jessica, is that similar to what you all did in Seattle?
So as much as we studied the Portland model really closely because we thought that this was an excellent way to go about creating a preference for Seattle, it wasn't the way that we ended, but it was really helpful. And so just for full disclosure, I'm from New York City, which is the longest, oldest preference policy in the country. And most folks are, if they've started doing some research on preference policies, they know that their lawsuit within New York City has really put a huge question mark around, are preference policies equitable or are they potentially discriminatory? And so we talked with a couple of those attorneys that were handling those cases or had been involved in bringing on cases of fair housing violations with community preference. And we put our heads together to figure out what were our outcomes supposed to be, and how does this work where a city where we weren't working with just urban renewal neighborhoods. We were looking at a displacement risk analysis the city had done back in 2016. And so we took that map and we we're talking with the mayor's office about using that map to create community preference within those census districts. The problem with that was that historically Black neighborhoods were then excluded because they already had been gentrified. So they no longer had a majority population that were Black, but now we're more mixed and mostly moving towards a white neighborhood. So how do we look back to think about creating an opportunity for folks to be able to come back? And within the city of Seattle, it's just such a small city that folks, when they move out, they normally leave the city boundaries, but stay within the county. So they're close ties. They're 15, 20 minutes away from their original base of where they grew up or where their grandparents lived. And so there is a cultural relationship with catchment organizations that have that catchment area where they did their cultural work. So what we did was I created 3 different preferences as a recommendation. And so the recommendation for the preferences are you live in the catchment area of that census tract or within a couple of the census tracts where that building is being built. You have cultural ties or community ties to that neighborhood. So you go to the food pantry, you have a faith-based organization, you go to for health resources. And then the other one is that you had formerly been displaced from the neighborhood. So these 3 recommendations for community preferences are really important because they're recommendations. And we're leaving it up to the developers to create their own policy as to making sure that we'll review it if there's a fair housing violation or we see a red flag. They also will have their own counsel reviewing it when they're ready to lease up. But essentially, if there is a fair housing violation or complaint coming in, it won't dismantle the entire idea. This is where the developers come in. They said, great, these are your recommended preferences. We will move forward on these, or maybe I'll add 1 or 2. We'll go through kind of like an analysis or a review if they have potential red flags for violating fair housing. And then they will administer their community preference policy. But it won't create put in question the concept of community preference in Seattle. So, and then just to add, and I'm sorry I jumped around for this because I think it might be also brought up in a future question, but the way to bring back those neighborhoods that were historically Black into the maps of where community preference could be incorporated, we did it with looking at 3 different indicators. One is race, second income levels, and then the third is education levels. And to be incorporated for that census tract to be incorporated within the community preference map, you had to meet over 2 or 3 of the indicators. So it couldn't just be solely on race because we would then it would be a red flag for HUD and bringing down the preference idea already for the city of Seattle.
But you could use race as one factor.
as one factor. Yeah.
But that's the race of the neighborhood, not the applicant.
Of the neighborhood, looking back at census tract data.
Interesting.
Interesting. So I feel like I hear Rick, you saying that one of the ways that that San Francisco has gotten around limitations is by sort of stacking a series of preferences on top of each other. And you talked about displacement preferences and eviction preferences on top of these neighborhood preferences. Davisha talked about a point system. And Jessica, it sounds like one of the ways that you've gotten around limitations is through enacting some really progressive recommendations for preference policies, but not making those legally required, and instead encouraging the developers to implement them. Is that right, Jessica? And are there other ways in which you're getting around some of the limitations of housing preference policies?
I think those are the main two. And for clarification, it's a permissive policy. So it's not mandated for all affordable housing developers. And then on top of that, it's a certain geography of the city. And there's arguments pro and con of this. But it's also, it takes some time and relationship building to get developers up to speed. A lot of them are really weary of doing community preference. We've had 3 projects so far successfully do it. We've enacted the policy or allowed for this in late 2019, and then the pandemic hit. So it's been a trickle. And I do kind of like a roadshow about every year to tell developers about it and hopefully calm their nerves.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of projects that are then choosing not to do it? Where they
Well,
could
because
do it?
it's permissible, so permissive. So at this point, it's you're told about it. You know, you got an award from the Office of Housing. You're excited about doing affordable housing. Are you doing preference? And then it's like, let me think about that. And now you have a whole year of pre-development before you're actually making the jump. It's not necessarily that they're saying no just yet.
Got it. And are you guys also involved, Jessica, in how those developers are doing outreach to inform the community about the housing and the preferences?
So I think that something really interesting about Seattle is that 95 or 98% of our developers are all not-for-profits. And so they're always are going to have a service piece to, mostly always are going to have a service piece to their organization in which they administer their affirmative or support their affirmative marketing. The affirmative marketing is taken really seriously, partnering up with organizations in the neighborhood, making sure that translation is done, in-person computer support for submitting the applications, if they're paper applications, making sure that they're accessible. So it's much more community run and the relationships are really good. I think where there might be a disconnect and where organizations struggle is when you're having a much larger affordable housing, not-for-profit that has been like a part of the makeup of City of Seattle, but doesn't have a cultural base. That is when there might be a disconnect. And so it's about me being able to work with them and saying, who are you getting to maybe support on getting folks with this community preference on board? Are you doing translations in these neighborhoods? Are you kind of doing what it needs to be done to get people aware of the preference? A really good example is Liberty Bank building. And if folks know about it, it's a beautiful project, but it was done before we allowed for community preference. And so this is the old Key Bank building that was the first bank built west of the Mississippi to make an impact for Black families to purchase their homes and really fight back against redlining. And so this building, it was really important for the Black community in the Central District in Seattle. And with the redevelopment of making it affordable housing was just done with affirmative marketing to a degree in which community was all hands on deck. So they went out the city limits and folks went to Black churches all in South King County. They really did vigorous outreach to make sure that people knew about it and people who had been displaced are able to come back. And that's what they did. So I think that that is to show that what I hope when I meet with community is that they get through is that exactly what Davisha said. It's not the silver bullet. It's one tool in the toolbox that we hope to really move the mark, but it's not the silver bullet where we specifically can be race forward, and then we can target in ways, and we can only target that community to be the applicants. The applicant pool must be, or there has to be an intent to make it diverse as possible.
Jessica, I hear you sort of talking about a funnel in a way, and that preferences can be sort of that pinch point at the funnel to make sure that the folks who are getting through are the ones that we're targeting, but that the affirmative marketing is really critical to ensure that we have enough folks to bring through that funnel such that when we get to that point of the preferences helping us to select, we have built a rich community of folks applying for housing who are in the communities that we're targeting. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Davisha, has that been your experience with affirmative marketing and pairing it with housing preferences in Portland as well?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And just to sort of piggyback on what Jessica said, we operate on a very similar model. Most of the developers that we work with are in fact, sorry, I froze I caught myself freezing for a minute. Hopefully you caught that part. Most of the developers that we do work with are nonprofits. So we really wanted to collaborate and work with them in getting the word out and providing different avenues for folks to engage directly with us, not only just us, but the developer. So we did a lot of tag teaming in how we reached out to the community organizations, churches, I mean, even going as microscopic as going to beauty salons, whether it's me handing a flyer to them directly or a community member doing the same. I'm so sorry.
Nothing can be done about it.
Yes, my dog has something to say about it too. But yes, I would definitely agree that we use the combination of that affirmative marketing and making sure that we utilize the tools we have within our government system to get the word out as well. Direct mailing was a great avenue as well, if I could add on to that.
And Zach, can I just underscore what I think they both just said, which is just that whether or not you have or can or are allowed to have a neighborhood preference isn't the final answer to whether or not you can have an equitable program. And we're just talking about marketing, but there's another side of it too, which is after selection, what happens between, you know, like someone wins the lottery and then who actually moves into the building. And there's just a lot of ways in which the system, whether it's in the outreach or in the screening of tenants, creates barriers that are not race neutral. And so even in San Francisco, where the preference policy results in a real improvement in the racial diversity of the winners of the lottery, the people who move into the housing are not moving in with the same frequency after they win the lottery. There's racial differences in the ultimate composition of the buildings, which we can only see because of the tool you helped build, Zach. The city built this application processing system, which they call Dahlia. Exig helped to build it. And so we have data about who applied for housing and then who ended up in the housing. And you can see there's a funnel, like a bad funnel of attrition in certain groups that's different. The shape of that funnel is different for different groups. And so, getting through the credit score, following through all the steps necessary to get actual residents in the housing unit has proven to be a barrier to equity. And so knowing that, the city now can take steps to try to fix each of the little points in the process where they're losing people. If the goal is equity, they all have to get some attention, and it's not just one thing. But I think for advocates and elected officials, we tend to look for the easy fix. And so we say, well, we're just going to adopt preferences and then that's going to take care of it. But we're not going to get equity if we don't fix all the outreach issues and all the screening issues. And we can get pretty far toward equity just fixing those things, even if we can't do a preference. The preference just becomes one piece in this bigger system. The whole system has to be designed around equity, or else the preferences don't get it done.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll just say that from my experience, just to get a developer to really intentionally do affirmative marketing, I think is the key. I think some of them just look at it as a part of the checklist that they have to do, and you're at 70% construction completion, and you're saying, well, I got to get this out of the door. And so let's reach out to these 5 organizations quickly. This is what we told the Office of Housing, let's just do it. And I think creating much more of an avenue, just like Rick was talking about, like creating a system in which there is more, there are more checks and balances to say, who are you reaching out to? Tell us the languages, like at 50% completion, what are the languages you're translating the documents for? Are you doing outreach at XYZ organizations? Because those are your hubs for potentially a target population of low-income folks that really could benefit from this housing. So I would say from the Office of Housing, that's what I'm definitely working on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you all taking the analogy I used earlier of the funnel, where I said that the top of the funnel was the affirmative marketing and the bottom of the funnel was the preferences, and saying, actually, no, there's more layers here. There's the layers of selection. There's the layers within that marketing plan. And then there's how do we measure within each of those layers? How do we ensure that we're not just doing perfunctory affirmative outreach, but in fact measuring that we are doing it in multiple languages, we are talking to XYZ CBOs, and how do we test in the placement process to ensure that the diversity that we're seeing at the level above it continues to be reflected as folks are continued to be selected for it. And Rick, I heard you use an example of credit score as one thing in that step of selection that can be negatively impactful on the outcomes of the folks that are placed. Are there other parts of that selection process that you've noticed are important to pay attention to ensure that we're not doing all the things right up top and then at the last step shooting ourselves in the foot?
Yeah, I mean, there are other pieces. They're mostly really obscure little details, but what we see is that, among people who win the lottery and have got this rare opportunity to get affordable housing, not everybody ends up taking the unit. And sometimes it's credit score, and sometimes it's other credit factors, like whether they've been on a lease before, how long they've had a lease, those kinds of credit standards that a property owner would implement. But some of it is just there's a uneven distribution of stable employment and stable income, and so if you've got a community that has turnover in their work more often, they're disadvantaged when it comes to accessing affordable housing, because they might win the lottery, but they might not have the income by the time the unit becomes available to them, or they might have to relocate to another community for a job and give up their affordable housing opportunity. Whereas folks who have, on average, more income stability are better able to take advantage of the available affordable housing unit. And so, it's a set of things that add up to a pretty noticeable difference in the percentage of people who take the lottery unit that's offered to them. And I think we see that difference everywhere, but most places don't have the data to really dig into it and try to figure out what the sources of the problem are. There's a similar thing with the city has this community of preference in San Francisco, has this certificate of preference program where families have these certificates, some of them from the early 60s, that entitle them to first opportunity for affordable units. But most of the families have not cashed those certificates in, and there's not great data about why, but it's largely that the affordable housing supply that we're building doesn't meet the needs of the population that we're trying to help. And so we're offering this kind of very thin piece of like a reparations framework, right? Like if people were displaced and we're trying to make it up to them, well, we'll make it up to them so long as they earn at least this much income, but not more than this much, and they want to live in this location in a unit configured this way, and then they can get this benefit. But most of those families now don't live in San Francisco anymore. They've moved somewhere else. They still have housing challenges, but we don't have a program that addresses their housing challenges. And if the intent was reparations, which I'm not saying it is, I don't think the city was clear about their intent, but if the intent was reparations, first chance at the affordable housing lottery isn't a very sufficient form of reparations. It's very limited. And I don't know, I'm curious in Portland, whether, Davisha, you think that, reparations is the right way to think about your policy, or is that really not the right terminology?
That's not the terminology that we can use. And I always, anytime we have avenues where we're speaking directly with the community members and with developers, I say that this is just a tool. This is a sort of a step to that. Real conversations around reparations will have those considerations because we run into similar issues. Somebody will be selected for housing, the housing opportunity, and we will run up against credit as a factor. If it's a rental housing opportunity, screening criteria can often be strict. So we have to go around and do policy changes around screening criteria and security deposits. And as you stated, we have a number of people who are contacted, but may not be able to pursue the housing opportunity because their jobs are in an industry that has those high turnover rates, or they simply, if we ignore the realities of what's happening now, we're currently in a pandemic, there are struggles for people to hold on to jobs because of a lot of mental health issues and other societal social factors. So we try not to, very long way of saying that, but we try not to say that this is a tool for reparation, but to say that this is a step in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's wise.
Thanks, June. Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
I just wanted to add that some folks also talk about it, and I don't know how the other panelists feel about the right of return. And I think that that's a really tricky term to embrace with this, because I don't think it's a right of return, for the simple fact that you're in a lottery. You apply at your own risk. You may meet the mark, you may not reach the credit score that they want or the income band. And so I think that that is a really important distinction to make, because I think as much as advocates really, I mean, for the city of Seattle, the only reason why we have a preference policy is because advocates really worked hard to create and to talk about a community preference. But I think that overreaching and calling it a right of return is just really disingenuous.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to do that.
I see that problem everywhere. I mean, I really think that's really well said. Like, it's policymakers, elected officials want to do something that sort of moves us in the direction of reparations or repairing past harms, but it's very hard to come up with things that they can pass right away that meet that standard, but then they apply that language to it in a way that I think is ultimately going to make people feel disempowered more than empowered. And one of the challenges with this whole framework about neighborhood preferences is that I won't say where, but I'm working in another community where they're in the process of considering neighborhood preferences, and the elected officials are very clear that they want it to be a form of reparation. They use the term reparations when they talk about it, right? They haven't adopted anything, so they haven't said exactly what they want, but the city displaced people, and they did it on the basis of race. They targeted a certain community, and they want to make up for that. But the tool of giving a neighborhood preference is now coming into a neighborhood where there's already been an enormous amount of displacement, and the African American community is no longer the majority. So they're going to give this preference to all the gentrifiers just as much as the long-term families. And that's probably better than not doing it, but to do that and to call it, this is us making up for the past, is a little problematic. And I think it's partly fair housing law that's forced us into this position, but it's even if the preference is effective at serving the needs of the descendants of the people who, the African American families who were harmed by city action, it's not effective emotionally if we can't call it what it is, if we can't, own up to it and say we're helping Black families, if that's who we're trying to help. And because of fair housing, we can't say we're helping Black families a lot of times. And so then people just it doesn't connect emotionally as like, we're trying to make something right that we did wrong in the past. And even when it's well-intentioned and effective, it still doesn't get the job done if we can't connect the thing we're trying to do with the language of, repair. And I think it's a huge problem across the whole housing field that we are using this double speak that's going over people's heads. And the elected officials are feeling good about it, but nobody else is really noticing it.
Rick, in that really powerful statement, thank you. You twice mentioned fair housing law as the constraint. I imagine there's other constraints, political as well. But can we talk about ways to balance equity-focused preferences and fair housing laws? How do we do it?
I mean, I think Portland's story is about the best on the ground example of, you know, like they're being explicit about the city's past actions, and they're saying, we're going to try to make up for that by having an intentional policy that provides benefits to the descendants of the people who suffered at the hands of public policy. They just have to do it in a still coy about the racial implications, but you know, it seems to be having the intended effect. What I would love to see is a piece of federal legislation that specifically allowed a city to have a racially targeted preference, not just a preference for people who used to live in the neighborhood, but people who look like the people who used to live in the neighborhood, who experience, you know, if you moved to Portland in the 90s, you didn't experience urban renewal, but you experienced all of the negative consequences of urban renewal. You're not eligible for Davisha's preference, but you still are experiencing the negative effects of segregation and discrimination. So if the city was allowed as part of a proactive, you know, effort to repair a specific harm in a documented community, to have race as one factor in selection, I would think that would be a good idea. It's just hard to change federal law around this issue without inadvertently undermining the important parts of fair housing and that are going to apply in all those places where, you know, it's holding the line against segregation. Like, I wouldn't necessarily want to jeopardize fair housing in order to win this.
So in the long run, it's about changing federal law. In the short, and doing so carefully in a way that doesn't undermine the important effects today. In the short run, everyone should copy Portland.
I don't think that's I didn't mean to say that. I mean, I think what each of these cities is doing is they are moving in the direction of something. We're not able to get to that something all the way, but that's not a reason not to move in that direction. And so whether it's affirmative marketing, whether it's using the race of the neighborhood as one factor in deciding whether to do preferences, the kinds of preferences San Francisco doing, they're all helping. They're just, it's just not the silver bullet that people want it to be.
I would even go as far as saying, as we run into the issues of the tool being very progressive and working, but again, where we have the opportunities not necessarily matching the needs of the folks, that would be something that would need to be addressed too. To comment on to Rick, I would also say that, yeah, we would definitely need a push for these federal change in our federal legislation and have it be more of a race preference without, of course, undermining for housing, but by rectifying the wrongs. I mean, we, in our particular jurisdiction, we are addressing, our research is predicated upon a lot of the redlining that has been going on, a lot of just the intentional segregation, the intentional eminent domain, which is telling somebody, we're going to offer you, in some cases they did not, but we're going to offer you a percentage of what this property is worth because we're wanting to use this for a public space. That needs to be something that the Supreme Court addresses, because that is something that is a right for the government to do. We would need to see a huge shift in the system and a real conversation around reparations in order for what the intent of these policies are trying to do to work on a scale that's actually meeting the needs of the people we're trying to serve.
Yeah.
Can I just add that I think one of the other limitations that I think are really important to know is, for the city of Seattle, we're only looking at areas with high risk of displacement, which end up being mostly communities of color. However, if we were to expand this, and I think this is more about my experience also in New York, is if we're expanding community preference into being a citywide potential policy, that you're looking at high opportunity areas where people of color and low income families have an opportunity to move into. And it's not resolving other issues that come into play. So for example, families of color that are moving into predominantly white neighborhoods because of fair housing laws and because there's an affordable housing development, may be more targeted by police by just walking around the neighborhood. I mean, we have a perfect example with Ahmaud Arbery taking a jog in a white neighborhood. Those are the type of implications that this could have or may have or may already be happening. The other thing is that with families with limited English access or having really close cultural ties, they no longer have access to those institutions or foods. So it's another thing. It's wonderful to think about community preference outside of maybe your targeted neighborhoods and thinking about other high opportunity neighborhoods with better schools or access to healthcare. But there are also there are major cons to that. The price of childcare, for example, will jump up and you won't have as many in-home daycares in pricey white neighborhoods than you do in the community that you're coming from. So it's a lot to think about as far as a preference when you're considering putting it into place.
I think we can retitle this panel "Preference is Not a Silver Bullet" when we do it next. So that's clear. Thank you, Jessica. So thanks, June, for reminding everyone that you can type your questions into the Q&A. I think we'll move into some of the audience questions we've gotten so far. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. We'll start with Kate. Kate asks, do any of the panelists have experience with preference housing projects running into fair housing law issues when seeking state, California, or federal funding? This has come up in some of my work with tribes who are seeking to build units for tribal members, but are unable to do so. Rick, I know you've done the most work in California. That might be a good one for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was saying. This is exactly what happened in San Francisco, that the city developed a preference program that they developed with a clear eye toward fair housing and, affirmatively furthering fair housing. And they submitted it to HUD and it was rejected. The folks who manage this at HUD don't like these preferences very much. And I don't blame them. Like, they're mostly spending their time fighting off jurisdictions that want to maintain segregation. And San Francisco is not immune from that. Like, it's not obvious just because it comes from San Francisco that it's going to be a fair preference policy. I think they're right to be vigilant about that. But it makes it difficult if you're trying to build tribal housing or, trying to prevent displacement in San Francisco, and they don't have the tools at their disposal to really be super nuanced. I don't think that people should be giving up. I think it's worth designing these policies and trying to make them, meet the needs. HUD has approved preference policies in plenty of places. It's just a matter of the diversity of the geography relative to the surrounding market. And the other thing I would say for everybody that's thinking about preferences is to use the preference conversation as an opportunity to open a broader dialogue about equity and how you can build a more equitable system. So you might have in your jurisdiction a lot of interest in preferences, and you might not be able to get preferences approved by California HCD or by HUD, but you shouldn't just say, okay, therefore we can't do it and stop. You should use the energy for preferences to push for better affirmative marketing, more investment in the resources to support people through the application process. And really what I think Davisha was saying a minute ago is try to build the housing that actually meets the needs. There's no law that prevents you from going out and figuring out what kind of housing do tribal members need? What kind of housing do people who were historically in the Black community and have been displaced, what do they need? What are they looking for? And then building housing that matches those needs. So whether it's income targeting or unit size or other, family configurations, if you build something that meets the specific needs of a particular group, that's not a violation of fair housing, if you then market it to everybody.
Yeah, I'll just add that we're working with an organization that supports and works, is a membership organization for Native folks in Seattle. So they submitted a community preference policy that they wanted to enact specifically for their members. But because their members are affiliated to the organization through a racial connection, we weren't able to, we noted that as a red flag. So when they submit an application to us or a template of what they're planning on doing, we're not approving or denying, but we are flagging it as a potential violation, and that's what we did. So they expanded not only to membership, but to also people who were receiving mail who in that particular census tract. So that way they were able to target the homeless population and who were just had a PO box in the neighborhood.
Davisha, anything to add about the work you did to ensure that your point policy was able to be approved by HUD, or was your point policy approved by HUD?
So the interesting thing about that is I actually encourage, and I spoke with someone who was studying their policy and just policies in general about this. I would encourage more cooperation with HUD. We didn't necessarily get approved by HUD. We implemented this, ran this across our local state government, as well as by our fair housing partner, who are partners with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. I think the lack of sort of partnering with them, I mean, they knew what it was, they knew what was going on, they were informed, they passed the information on to their to their networks. I think we run against the preferences that they have within our local housing authority has within their buildings and our preferences. That lack of collaboration and that sort of approval process you're kind of talking about, that didn't happen. And that's something I would encourage anyone who's implementing preferences to make sure that that's one of your first steps, because we've missed the opportunity of having a lot of buildings subject to our policy. They have been exempt if they have any type of Section 8 or project-based Section 8 units within their buildings. So no, we did not, in short, and please work with your local agent, your local housing authority.
Another thing that occurs to me, Zach, is that, I mean, we've been talking a lot about sort of taking for granted the assumption that the goal of the public agency is, you know, redressing racial harm or racial equity more generally, but that's not always the case. And even where it is a goal, it's not always the only goal. And sometimes there are other goals that are nefarious, and sometimes there are other goals that are appropriate. And in some places, like, you know, displacement is not something that only affects one racial group or another. Like there's loss of neighborhood character everywhere, and people rightly concern themselves about displacement, even, you know, of white communities. There's work that the jurisdiction has to do about why it's doing a preference and what it's trying to accomplish. And sometimes doing that work is valuable, even if you can't implement the preference that you want because it violates fair housing. It might lead you to better understand, you know, what the problem is you're trying to solve, and then solve it in some other way. And I don't think it's a terrible thing that communities, even, you know, historic white communities, want to maintain some sort of, you know, historic, this is how we've always been, but they have to do extra work to think about that in a way that's not just sort of this quick proxy for race. And that can be done. Like there's you know, there's communities that do that. But just to go quickly to preferences in that case is probably a big mistake, you know. But I think it's about, can the community be explicit about what it's trying to do and what it hopes to accomplish, and then maybe preference is not always the right tool.
Thanks, Rick. I'm gonna keep coming back to this analogy of the funnel. I feel like if we were summarizing this panel, I'd want us to have a visual. And Rick, I've heard you layer something else on top. Before we talked about affirmative marketing as being the top of the funnel, but I'm hearing you talk about two things that come before that. They're really both about engaging the community and figuring out what folks need and ensuring that the housing that we're building is going to match the needs for the communities we're targeting, and also then ensuring that whatever we're putting in the lower levels of that funnel, whether they're preferences or other selection tools, are the right things for those communities, are going to have the outcomes we want. So I hear you talking about community engagement up here before we do the marketing, before we do the preferences, and before we do the selection, each of which is a layer of policy that can help ensure that we are implementing more equitable housing practices in our communities. Okay, I'm going to go to, I think we have probably time for one more question. Karen asked, can you address educator staff housing preferences? Karen, I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Is there anything else you can add there? Panelists, do you get it?
Yeah, I think what she's asking about is where we give a preference to people who are teachers or work for the school district, or people who are staff of some, other public agency, or like sometimes it's first responders. And those preferences can also run into fair housing issues if the populations, are not diverse themselves. But the other thing, which we haven't talked much about on this session so far, is just the logistics of implementing the preferences. Sometimes we end up with too many preferences, and it becomes really difficult to implement the lottery and to select residents, because you've got these tiers of preferences. But the educator preferences or the first responder preferences can be really popular, or like they sort of help elected officials feel like, oh, this is who the affordable housing is for. I think partly because people have misconceptions about who the general population of affordable housing residents are and what their occupations are. So, when people say they want to do a educator preference, I often think that's a opportunity to do more education about who lives in affordable housing. But I don't know if you guys have educator preferences. San Francisco does have a program. Do you have them in Portland or Seattle? Teacher housing preferences?
No, we don't.
Yeah. You see them a lot in home ownership in particular, for some reason. Home ownership programs will often target teachers.
Thanks, Rick. So in closing, is there any last piece of advice anyone wants to give for folks working at the intersection of affordable housing and developing equitable policies?
Good question.
I'll add that I have been working on like social justice issues since I was about 15. And I then am a trained, like educated urban planner, but I'm a total bureaucrat. But if I didn't have that relationship with community and understanding that development is not rocket science, development is a balance sheet, but ultimately it's about relationship building. And being an organizer and understanding what community is advocating for and why those conversations need to be at the table with bureaucrats, and figuring out who creates these forms, who creates these policies, who is now evaluating these competitive awards that end up happening for RFPs and RFQs, is that the voices of advocates and organizers are really important and should be a pillar of our work. And I'm not only speaking about community preference, but if we don't really add them to the analysis or add them to, to see if the project pencils out, we're not being equitable in any way. Community and the most impacted are going to be able to shed light or give language to what we need to do and how to push these policies forward. And it's taken me a couple of years to be able to get folks okay with some parts of community preference and other pieces at work. But we must be helpful to community advocates in pushing what they are looking for. At the same time is that they deserve transparency and complete honesty from us. So we can't beat around the bush, and we can't be afraid of the backlash or the letters to the mayor. We have to be transparent and open with community because they deserve that. But that's how we build trust. If we aren't going to be straight shooters with them, they're just not going to have our back. And I think it really is important for us to consider them in the whole strategy.
What Jessica said just reminded me of something else that I think we didn't talk enough about, and really is in some sense part of the answer to Kate's question about, what do we do if HUD won't approve our preferences? And it's just about data, that there's this culture in housing that we need to have fair access to the units, but somehow we don't ever need to, share the information about who got the housing. And, everyone's attentive to this question of the racial composition of the residents of affordable housing, in particularly in these sort of high diverse urban communities. But we don't often share that information, and sometimes that's because it's just really hard to get that information. But it's also just really loaded, right? People are worried they're going to get sued, or there's going to be a lot of conflict, and so they it's hard enough to build affordable housing without having an extra source of conflict. But in some sense, we owe it to people to have more transparency about who's getting the affordable housing, and that transparency will create a pressure to do a better job on actually, affirmatively furthering fair housing. Because the unfortunate reality is just, not allowing racial preferences hasn't gotten the job done of, the housing going equally to everybody. There are still real barriers to who gets affordable housing. And if we had a complete accounting, we would not be happy with the results. And we shouldn't be happy with. We shouldn't hide that from ourselves. It would help us all if we had to do it. And I don't expect jurisdictions on their own to sort of report that data, but it'd be nice if the state and the federal government were doing more to collect that data, anonymize it, and share it broadly, so the policy community as a whole could see how well or how poorly we're doing at fairly allocating the affordable housing that we have across racial groups. Because my guess is we still have a long way to go to even get to fair, much less to repairing past harms.
Yeah, Rick, I agree completely. And not only can the data show us how we're doing right now, but it can also, we might have well-meaning policies that that we're not sure how effective they are, and the data can allow us to measure whether those policies are changing from where we're at now, and if not, give us the ability to nimbly change and put new policies in place and test those and see how they work. So thank you for that. Davisha, anything you want to add before we wrap here?
Yes, I think the co-panelists have wrapped it up wonderfully. I would say that my last tidbit advice is making sure that you're engaging community in all aspects of the project, the beginning phase, the middle of the phase, and after the phase. I think that one of the things that I failed to mention earlier in this policy is that this was something that community pushed for that relied on a piece of property. It was neighborhood, a community member seeing a number of developers coming into neighborhood, buying property for very cheap and building things like stores or apartments that people could not get into. But people were having these conversations long before this was happening. People were seeing this long before it actually happened, and we're trying to have people at the table, and they were denied, and things were cut at every angle because of that indirect racism that exists within our governmental systems. And as somebody who, yes, I am a city employee, I am also, as my co-panelist says, a bureaucrat, but I think that it is very important to remember that we are community members first. And as long as we're implementing policies like this, we need to make sure that we're giving way, not being the voice for, but giving voices, giving opportunities for people in the community to share their voices and their opinions on the policies and programs that we are implementing. So yeah, that would be my only tidbit. Make sure everyone is involved on board, mainly your community members, of course, your community-based organizations and your partners and your co-developers and your project sponsors, but more importantly, the community that you're building the properties for.
Thank you, Davisha. Engage the communities, make sure we're honest with them, make sure we're bringing them in all the time. Let's think about the parts of the funnel, from who we're engaging, what we're deciding to build, where we're deciding to build it, who we're reaching out to when we're letting folks know about the opportunities. Preferences are a piece of that, and so is selection, deciding how we're going to ensure that we're not forcing people out at the last stage after they've already won the lottery. And preferences aren't a silver bullet. All of these pieces are necessary for our communities to move to repair past harms and have more equitable outcomes for our communities. So thank you to the panel. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Davisha. Thank you, Rick. Thank you for the great questions to the audience. Thanks, Tori, for keeping us on time and organized here. And thanks, Brooks, for the captioning. I believe we'll have this panel available to share afterwards. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. Again, we're all on LinkedIn. You can find us easily. And if you have any other questions, we'd be happy to talk. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Housing California.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.